He came to court to stand up for someone else quietly, respectfully, and without needing recognition. But when a young officer mistook him for a threat and placed him in handcuffs, she had no idea who he really was. What happens when justice wears no uniform, but carries the weight of a nation? If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Now let's dive into the history that proves sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truth. For the kind of morning that felt too still. The courthouse in Schley County, Georgia, sat quiet under a pale gray sky, its steps worn smooth by years of hopes, fears, and hard truths passing through. Amon entered alone through the side door. No uniform. No stars on his collar. No ribbons on his chest, just a plain button-down shirt, pressed slacks, and a worn leather briefcase that had clearly traveled. His name was Carlton Hayes, 64. He's steady on his feet, but he moved like a man used to staying out of the spotlight. And today he did just that. He found a wooden bench outside Courtroom band, sat without fanfare in his case deployment records, sworn statements, and a letter handwritten on Department of Defense stationery. He wasn't here for himself, he had come to speak for someone else, a young black man, a former soldier, under his command, now standing trial for assaulting a police officer, a man who'd worn the same uniform. A man Carlton believed the system had failed. He could have called ahead. He could have had security, clear a path, or announced his rank, but he chose not to. Because today he wasn't showing up as a general. He was showing up as a citizen, as a witness. Asa, a man doing what he believed was right. To everyone else in the hallway, he was just an old black man, sitting quietly with a briefcase on his lap and worth noticing, and no one to fear inside the courtroom. The atmosphere was already tight. The case had stirred debate across town. A veteran accused of attacking an officer during a late-night stop. Some called it justice, others called it payback, but no one, not the bailiff, not the attorneys, not even the judge, knew that. The quiet man outside had once led missions across 4 continents, had briefed presidents, and carried secrets locked behind layers of clearance. He wasn't there to be recognized. He was there to remind the system what justice was supposed to look like. The hallway was quiet. Just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of leather shoes on polished tile. Carlton sat with one leg crossed over, the other scrolling through his phone. He'd just received an email from the defense attorney, confirmation that his name had been officially logged as a witness in case 17A. He smiled faintly, relieved. All the documentation he brought, signed statements, character reports, was in order. Everything was where it needed to be. He stood up and walked a few steps down the corridor, glancing at a set of bulletin boards. Aligning the wall at the end of the hallway was a small glass window labeled Clerk, Legal Submissions. A sign on the counter read Witness Packet Submit. Before courtroom entry, Carlton adjusted his grip on the briefcase and made his way forward. But the layout of this old courthouse was strange. Signs were unclear, and before he realized it, he'd crossed a line on the floor, one marked only by a worn metal plate that read faintly, Staff Only. It was then that she saw him. Officer Tracy Willern had been standing near the side exit, arms crossed, posture tight, newly transferred, full of rules and reasons to assert control, white mid-30s fit, and stern. Here he scanned the hallway like a heat sensor, locking onto anything that didn't look normal, and Carlton Hayes to her didn't. She stepped forward, quick and firm, blocking his path with one hand, resting on her utility belt. Sir, what exactly are you doing back here? Carlton turned to her calmly. I'm submitting documentation. I have paperwork to deliver for case 17. I believe this is where it goes. She tilted her head, skeptical. Did you not see the sign that says Staff Only? You can't be here. I do apologize. Carlton replied, the signs weren't very clear. I wasn't trying to. 'Cause any trouble? What's your name? Carlton Hayes. Do you have identification on you? Carlton nodded. Of course, it's in my briefcase. May I step away from the bag? She snapped, raising her hands slightly. Keep your hands visible. There was a pause. A cold one. Carlton looked her directly in the eyes, steady, unfazed. I'm a witness, he said evenly, here on behalf of the defense in 17. The lawyer just emailed me to confirm I was heading to the submissions window, nothing more. But Willern had stopped listening the moment he stepped over that line. I said, back away from the bag. Carlton drew a slow breath. Ma'am, I assure you there's nothing dangerous in here, just documents, and if I could just... That's enough. Her voice cut clean through the hallway, louder now. A few heads Turned someone waiting near the courtroom doors looked up from their phone. Another leaned forward in their seat unsure of what they were seeing. Tracy stepped closer. You're in a restricted area, acting evasive, refusing to follow basic commands I need. Pooh, to place your hands where I can see them now. Carlton raised both hands, calmly, palms open. I'm cooperating, he said, and I'd prefer not to escalate. This served this country for over 30 years. I know the rules that made her pause, but only briefly then. You should know better than to be somewhere. You don't belong, she replied sharply. You're not allowed back here, you don't have clearance. Carlton kept his voice level, and yet I'm here to uphold the law, not break it. You're treating me like a threat when all I've done is try to help. But it didn't matter in Tracy's eyes. He wasn't a decorated veteran, he wasn't our respected witness. He's a tall black man with a briefcase and no badge in sight. And that was enough final warning, she said, hand now hovering near her holster. Step away from the bag now, and just like that, respect became suspicion, a wrong turn became an accusation. And a man who came to stand up for someone else was now the one being forced to stand down. Tracy's stance shifted, feet planted, posture firm. One hand hovered near her holster. The other reached back and unclipped her baton with a sharp click. The sound alone was enough to turn a few more heads in the hallway. Carlton remained motionless, hand still raised. His voice stayed calm, measured. In my briefcase, he said gently. There's a signed witness certificate from the court clerk. I'm listed on the record. There are documents for the defense. There's no weapon, no threat, but to Tracy Wilburn. The words didn't matter. She'd already made up her mind. She pressed the radio clip to her shoulder. This is Officer Wilburn, Hallway B. I have a male subject, non-compliant, possibly evasive, requesting backup. The hallway seemed to shrink, conversations quieted, even the echo of distant footsteps down. The corridor faded into a tense collective silence. Carlton's eyes moved slowly, scanning the people around him. A dozen or so sat along the benches, family members, clerks, a few lawyers preparing for cases. No one said a word. I am not resisting, he said. I served 33 years and know how this goes, but you are making a mistake. Tracy stepped forward. Turn around, hands behind your back. Officer, he said, just above a whisper, you're escalating something that doesn't need to be. I've complied. I've answered. Haven't. Move, turn around. There was no more room for discussion. Carl exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He turned deliberately, slowly. His shoulders relaxed, not in submission, but in control as she gripped his wrist and snapped the cuffs into place. The metal clinked, louder than it should have. Every person watching heard it. Some flinched, others looked away. He stood there, cuffed like a criminal. Not 20 FT from the courtroom, where he had come to testify. A man in his 50s sitting near the door leaned toward the woman beside him. Why the hell is she doing that? He whispered. The woman shook her head, eyes fixed on the scene. But she said nothing. No one did. A buff glanced up from his paperwork, saw what was happening, then quickly looked back down the court. Clerk seated behind her glass window froze for half a second, then quietly slid her window shut. Not one person stepped forward. Not one asked why, because even when something looked wrong, it only was easier to stay seated. Carlton, now fully restrained, didn't struggle. He didn't speak again. He simply stood in place, breathing through his nose, eyes fixed forward, his back straight, his dignity intact, but the air around him felt heavier, as if justice itself had turned away. What made it worse wasn't the handcuffs. It was the silence, the kind that isn't born of confusion, but complicity. To Tracy, this was protocol. To the others, this was a moment they didn't want to get involved in. Carlton, it was history repeating itself quietly, predictably, painfully. He had walked into that courthouse as a witness, and now, without raising his voice, without stepping out of line, without so much as stouching his briefcase, he was standing there like a suspect. No one shouted. No one fought. And yet something deeply wrong had just taken place right in front of everyone, in a building designed to protect the truth. The cuffs were cold, tighter than necessary. Carlton didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply stood still, letting the moment settle. A few people were now openly staring. Some held phones low in their laps, camera apps quietly open, but not yet recording. Not yet. They were waiting, unsure what this was, but sensing it might become something more. Tracy stepped to the side, speaking quickly into her radio again. Her tone had shifted still, firm, but there was a tremor, not fear. Just the rush of adrenaline that comes when power is used, and no one pushes back. Carlton finally spoke. Calm, controlled officer, he said, without turning his head. I'd like to make a phone call. I'm entitled to that, I believe. She didn't answer right away. Then with a mocking smile she leaned into. Who, she said, your lawyer, or should I call the White House for you while I'm at it? A few people nearby chuckled, nervously, the kind of laugh that comes when tension spills over, and no one quite knows how to act. Carlton turned, his head slightly toward her. His voice never rose above conversational. No need, he said. The Pentagon will do. The hallway went still again. Tracy blinked, then laughed loud, sharp, exaggerated, the kind of laugh that dares others to join in just to make the moment less awkward. Oh, really, she scoffed. The Pentagon? Sure, that's original. What's next? NASA, CIA, you one of those YouTube prank guys or something? Carlton didn't answer. He simply looked at her, not defiant, not smug, just steady, measured, the way a man looks when he knows something the rest of the room hasn't caught up to yet. Give me your phone, she said suddenly. If you're so important, let's see what kind of magic numbers you've got. She reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sleek black phone. Government issued, secured with a matte finish that didn't reflect light. No case, no stickers, just numbers. She held it up like it was a joke. Let me guess, do I press one for the Secretary of Defense? Still, Carlton said nothing. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said, there's a number in the starred contacts, just dial it. Tracy rolled her eyes and swiped the screen. All right, General Hayes, she said, with exaggerated sarcasm. Let's see who picks up. She hit the contact. It rang once, twice, then a voice answered, clear, direct, unmistakably military. Major Kendall, Joint Operations Command. Tracy's posture shifted. Instantly, the color drained from her face, just enough to notice there was a long pause. Carlton, still cuffed, finally spoke again, his tone as steady as before. This is General Carlton Hayes. I'm being unlawfully detained at the Schley County Courthouse in Georgia. In need verification sent immediately. Major Kendall didn't hesitate. Are you secure, sir? For now, we'll have confirmation inbound in minutes. Stay on the line. I'm looping in Pentagon liaison and DHS. There was a soft beep. Another voice came on, this one deeper. More clip, Commander. Reeves, sir, we're tracking your coordinates, verifying. Your ID. Local authorities will be contacted directly. Expect federal response within 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that's all it would take for the world to shift. Tracy didn't say a word. She stood, frozen phone still in hand, lips parted, but no sound coming out. Carlton gently turned back toward the hallway. A few more phones were up now, recording. One teenager whispered, I think that's really him. From a corner, a man in a plaid shirt muttered to his wife. He told her she just didn't listen. And in that moment, the noise didn't come from shouting. It came from the silence, between a truth ignored and a truth that was about to roar through the front doors. And black SUVs. She thought she was dealing with just another old man with too much pride. What she didn't know was that pride had clearance. Carlton remained calm, even as Tracy held the phone a few inches from her ear, as if unsure whether to speak or just hang up and pretend nothing had happened. But the line was still open. The voice on the other end didn't waver. Commander Reeves here. We have your signal, sir. You are on a restricted channel tied to Department of Defense. Senior protocols. Are you currently secure? Carlton answered evenly. Cuff, courthouse hallway, civilian law enforcement. Not yet aware of who they're holding, Reeves responded without hesitation. Acknowledged, contacting Pentagon liaison and U.S. Marshal Service. Now response units already mobilized. There was a pause, then a calm reassurance. Stand by. General, you are not alone. Tracy lowered the phone slowly. Her mouth opened slightly as if she was about to argue, but the words wouldn't form. She looked down at the screen one more time, maybe expecting to find some trick, some prank, something to prove this was all a joke, but it wasn't. It had never been. She handed the phone back to Carlton with a rigid motion, avoiding eye contact. Carlton didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just held the phone, hands still cuffed, behind him, and watched the hallway change. The energy had shifted. The man who had been invisible minutes ago now stood at the center of something that made everyone pay attention. Not because he was yelling, not because he was threatening, but because finally they were seeing him for what he was. 6 minutes passed. A silence grew in the space-thick electric expectant. A few more phones were raised, filming. No one was pretending anymore. They knew something was coming, and then it came. The sound of tires on gravel outside, a loud, unmistakable hum of engines that didn't belong to standard patrol cars. 3 black SUVs, unmarked windows tinted darker than legal, moving like they weren't used to stopping for anything. They pulled in tight. One blocked the courthouse's front entrance, another stopped just outside the side lobby. The third, slower, deliberate, parked near the judge's reserve space. Doors opened in perfect rhythm from the lead vehicle. 2 men stepped out in dark suits with subtle earpieces and no visible badges. They didn't need them. From the second SUV came a woman in uniform, Colonel Barson, her shoulder face unreadable, posture like granite, and from the third stepped a tall man in full dress uniform, U.S. Army Silver Eagles, rows of accommodations across his chest, a polished cover under one arm. A steel gaze aimed directly at the courthouse door. He didn't run. He walked, measured, control, powerful in the way only people trained to hold power without flaunting it can be inside. Noon moved. Tracy stood frozen. In place, the radio at her shoulder crackled quietly, then died into static. The man in uniform entered the building. He scanned the hallway once, slowly, before locking eyes with Carlton. General Hayes, he said, voice low but clear. Carlton nodded once. Sir, the man continued, we received your alert. You're in contact with Joint Command. DHS liaison has been notified. We'll take it from here at that. He turned to Tracy, who instinctively took a step back. Are you the officer who'd detained him? She stiffened. Yes, he was in a restricted zone. He refused. He raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. That man, he said calmly, has top-level clearance with the Department of Defense. You placed him in restraints without verifying ID, and you broadcast his detention over an unsecured channel. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse, but his words hit like thunder in a church. Your actions, he continued, will be reviewed under federal protocol. Until then, you're relieved of supervisory authority. And this building stepped back, and just like that, where the weight shifted, the cuffs still clung to Carlton's wrists, but everyone in that hallway knew the real power had arrived. The footsteps echoed through the marble hallway like a metronome. Slow, precise, undeniable. Door scracked open, heads turned. The chatter in the courtroom evaporated. A tall man in full uniform entered, flanked by 2 silent officers. His ribbons and medals didn't make a sound, but they didn't need to. His presence did. He paused near the doorway and looked across the room, his voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. General Carlton Hayes, is he here? The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was the kind that made people shift in their seats, made breath catch halfway, made judgment curl back into the shadows where it belonged. All eyes turned slowly, collectively toward Carlton, still in cuffs, still standing, with the same quiet dignity that had never once left him. Tracy's lips parted. Her jaw moved as if to say something. But only one word made it out. You're a General. Carlton didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn fully toward her. He just spoke with the same calm he'd kept from the moment she stopped him. I told you all you had to do was check the folder in my case, she said. Nothing from the other side of the room. Judge stood, an older man, gray-haired, robes a little too long, confusion written across his face. Officer, what is going on here? The judge asked, voiceless, commanding, then uncertain. But the man in uniform didn't wait for explanation. He stepped forward, removed a leather folder from beneath his arm, and held it out. With practice motion authorization from the Department of Defense, he said. Clearance, confirmation, liaison, contact, formal complaint. Pending. The judge glanced down at the document, then back up at the man before him. Is this real? Yes, Your Honor. The man standing behind your officer. He nodded toward Carlton, is Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, retired 3 stars, former lead of Joint Operations Southeast Command. And today your system treated him like a criminal while he was performing a civic duty. The judge opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to excuse. But the colonel raised a hand slightly in disrespect, just to say it, gently. This is no longer a matter for local interpretation. He turned to Tracy. She looked smaller now, not because he loomed, but because everything she had assumed, everything she had projected, had just shattered. I didn't know, she began. He cut her off. You didn't ask a pause, the kind of pause that rewrites a moment into memory. Then he turned back to the judge. We're not here to interfere with the court's operations, but a federal review will proceed immediately. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure of recognition. and it happened in a building where justice is supposed to begin, not break down. There was no shouting, no banging of gavels, just the weight of realization settling over every person in the room. Carlton remained silent throughout. But in that silence there was power. Not because he'd outranked anyone, but because he had never needed to. His authority didn't come from a badge or a uniform or thiemen in black suits outside. It came from how he stood, how he spoke, how he didn't break even when the system assumed he had no reason to stand tall. This was not the twist of a story. It was the reveal of a truth that had been in plain sight all along, ignored, dismissed, and now undeniable. The sound of the cuffs unlocking was quiet, barely more than a metallic whisper, but in a room full of people who just witnessed what silence could cost, it rang louder than any gavel. The officer who removed them didn't speak. He just stepped back. Carlton flexed his wrist gently, letting the blood flow return. Then lowered his arms and straightened his jacket, still calm, still composed. The judge looked uncertain, so did the bailiff. Even the colonel, standing tall near the bench, kept a respectful silence, all eyes turned to Carlton. He didn't rush to speak. He let the quiet settle. He let people sit with what had just happened. Then, with the kind of voice that doesn't need a microphone to be heard, he looked directly at Tracy, then out toward the gallery, and said, "She didn't detain me because of what I did." His tone was level, no bitterness, no drama, just truth. "She detained me because of what she assumed I was." A few people shifted in their seats. The silence tightened again, not uncomfortable this time, but reverent listening. Carlton took one slow breath before continuing. "I didn't ask her to know who I am. I didn't demand she salute or check rank or treat me differently. Didn't need her to see a general." He paused just for a beat, just enough to let the next sentence land. "I needed her to see a man in the front row." A young woman, barely 20, law school textbooks still open on her lap, lifted her phone and started recording. Her hand trembled slightly, not from nerves but from the sense that this moment might matter. Beyond these walls, Carlton looked around the room, slowly, his gaze touching everyone and no one. "I've led operations across continents. I've briefed presidents. I've stood beside men in combat who look nothing like me, would bled the same, and none of that. None of it matters if the moment I take off my uniform, I become something to fear again." The words weren't shouted, but they filled every inch of the courtroom. He glanced back at Tracy, not to shame her, but to let her hear it directly. "You didn't see a threat, you saw a type, and you acted on it." Tracy didn't move. She didn't argue. There was nothing to say. Carlton looked back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm still willing to testify in case 17A. The young man on trial today deserves better than what I received, and I didn't come here to make a point. Came here because I still believe in what this room is supposed to stand for." He stepped back, hands folded in front of him, not asking for applause, not looking for redemption, just finished. And yet in that pause something shifted, not in the law, but in the people. The courtroom remained quiet. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This was the silence of self-reflection, of people seeing more than they had chosen to. Moments earlier, the young woman with the phone stopped recording. She blinked hard, lowered the camera, and whispered to herself, "That needs to be seen." An hour later, her clip went online. Within 3 more, that 50,000 views by Sunset. National headlines were quoting a single sentence. "I didn't need her to see a general, I needed her to see a man." In a place built for judgment, one man reminded everyone, watching, that dignity doesn't demand recognition, it just refuses to disappear. By the time the courthouse emptied that afternoon, the air had changed. The story had already begun to ripple beyond the building's old brick walls. Local reporters outside were gathering statements, checking names, piecing together fragments of what had unfolded inside Courtroom B. But most of them didn't get far, because the man at the center of it all, Carlton Hayes, had already declined every interview. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't pose for cameras. He simply walked down the courthouse steps, briefcase in hand, and kept going inside. However, the reaction had just begun. Officer Tracy Wilburn was pulled from duty. Immediately, badge, a surrendered firearm handed over. She didn't protest, didn't cry, didn't say much of anything. The only sound she made was the quiet breath she exhaled when The official suspension order was read aloud, signed not just by the sheriff but co-signed by a Department of Defense liaison. That evening, a formal inquiry was opened. The Pentagon issued a direct request for a full audit of every arrest, citation, and courtroom incident Wilburn had been involved in over the past 5 years. Not as punishment, at least not yet, but to uncover whether this was a pattern or a warning long ignored. What they would find, no one yet knew. But people were watching now. This time they weren't turning away. The presiding judge, who had once looked away from the cuffs and Carlton's wrists, stood before reporters the following morning and offered the first public statement. "We, as a local court, failed to act when we should have. We allowed assumption to override accountability, and for that we apologize, especially to General Hayes and to anyone who has ever walked through our doors and not been seen for who they truly are. No excuses, no justifications, just the start of something resembling responsibility." Meanwhile, the video recorded by the law student Carlton's quiet words echoing through the courtroom had surpassed 2 million views. It was being shown in classrooms, shared by veterans groups, reposted by civil rights organizations. The sentence people quoted most wasn't angry. It wasn't even directed at anyone in particular. It was this: "I didn't need her to see a general. I needed her to see a man." But while the world debated the meaning, Carlton had already left it behind. He boarded a late afternoon train out of Shaw County and rode back south toward Fort Benning. No staff, no entourage, just him in a window seat when a journalist called up to him briefly at the station and asked why he wouldn't speak to the media. Carlton paused, then offered a sentence just as quiet as the man himself. "I'm not chasing attention," he said. "I'm chasing back the silence for those who lost it." No dramatic exit, no headlines, in his own voice, just a closing line that landed not with noise but with weight. In a world that often rewards outrage, one man chose restraint, and somehow that restraint shook more than any shout could. 1 week later, the storm had passed, but the story hadn't. None of headlines, no breaking news banners. The cameras had turned to elsewhere, as they always do. But at Fort Benning, an Amethyst auditorium lined with folding chairs and fresh uniforms, the echoes of what happened in the Georgia courthouse were just beginning to take root. The cadets sat straight, attentive, some still new enough to shine their boots every morning, others close to graduation, sharp, proud, but not yet tested. Carlton Hayes stood at the podium. No medals, no uniform, just a charcoal gray suit and a presence that quieted the room before he even spoke. He looked out over them, young men and women from every background, every walk of life, each of them about to step into a system that demanded more than just obedience. It asked for judgment, integrity, clarity. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. "You don't wear the uniform so people fear you," he said, voice low but deliberate. "You wear it so they can see you and so they can trust what they see." The silence after that line wasn't empty. It was absorbed, like each word landed somewhere inside them, somewhere personal. Carlton paused, then added, "Your rank may earn attention, but your conduct earns belief." A few cadets scribbled notes, others just sat with it. That was the lesson, not about power, not about pride, but about presence, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice, tossed and tall. That same week, the Department of Education in Georgia quietly issued a curriculum update in a new section of their high school civic studies material. A case study appeared: Schlake County Courthouse Incident, Ethics, Bias, and Moral Leadership. It didn't name names, it didn't dramatize, it simply outlined a moment when assumption met truth, and the difference came down to how one man carried himself in the face of disrespect. Teachers began using it not just as an example of civil rights, but of personal responsibility, of what it means to choose dignity. When retaliation would have been easy, the clip of Carlton's courtroom words was now archived by several law schools as part of modern cases' response to institutional bias. One professor described it as the cleanest example of moral restraint I've ever seen on camera. He didn't burn the building down, reminded them why it was built. As for Carlton, he didn't seek awards, he didn't sit for documentaries. He returned to mentoring young officers quietly, visiting training sessions around the Southeast, sometimes speaking, sometimes just observing. But wherever he went, people recognized something, even if they didn't always know his name: a presence, a steadiness, a kind of justice that didn't need to shout, because justice, when done right, doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it walks out of a courthouse in silence and leaves behind a room that will never forget what it saw. Sometimes The strongest voices don't come from shouting, but from standing firm when it matters most. This story wasn't about rank it, was about recognition, about seeing people for who they are, not who assume them to be. And above all, it was about quiet courage, the kind that leaves a lasting mark without making a sound. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac Stories for more powerful, true-to-heart narratives, just like this one. Your support means more than you know. Every comment, every share, every new subscriber gives our small creative team the strength to keep going and to keep telling stories that matter. We're not just here to entertain, we're here to remind each other what dignity, decency, and justice still look like. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay kind, stay thoughtful, and keep listening for the quiet truths.